Poor, single mom, boarded the wrong flight. Didn't know the man sitting beside her was the lonely CEO who'd change her life. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you right now." The voice was urgent but hushed. Julia looked up, startled. A flight attendant stood beside her, leaning slightly inward, her tone calm but firm. "You're not supposed to be on this flight," she said quietly. "Your boarding pass was issued under a different name, Julianne Dawson." "There's been a mix-up." Julia's heart thudded. She instinctively clutched her sleeping son tighter. I boarded at the right gate," she said, her voice shaking. "I believe you, but your name isn't on the manifest, and since we've already left the gate, we can't return. You'll need to stay in your seat. We'll take care of it after we land." Julia stared, stunned. Her cheeks burned. She could feel the eyes now, passengers glancing over, murmuring. Her breath hitched. "I didn't mean to do anything wrong," she said softly. "You're not in trouble," the attendant reassured her. "It happens more often than you think. Just sit tight." Julia nodded faintly, swallowing against the dryness in her throat. Her son stirred, then settled again. She lowered her gaze, pressing her cheek against his hair, trying to disappear. Only a few hours earlier she had been waiting at the terminal. Her blonde ponytail was messy, her coat too big, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. She looked older than 29, not because of age, but because of exhaustion and years of single motherhood. She had been heading to her mother's house in Maine. Months of saving had made this trip possible. Noah's asthma was worsening again, and her mom had begged her to come home for a while. Julia had finally agreed. The airport had been crowded. When boarding was called, the surge of passengers pushed forward. Jostled, she didn't notice her boarding pass fall from her pocket. Another pass was already on the floor nearby. She picked it up, thinking it was hers. She didn't notice the name Julianne Dawson was printed on the top. At the gate, the staff member barely looked up. She saw a young mother with a sleeping child and waved her through. No questions, no ID check. And now here Julia sat on a plane, heading to the wrong destination, too late to fix anything. Her face burned. Her son, still asleep, shifted slightly. She rocked him gently, trying to steady her own breath. Passengers around her whispered. Someone turned to glance at her, then looked away. Julia stared ahead, her vision blurring. The man beside her had said nothing throughout. She hadn't looked at him until now. From the corner of her eye, she saw him, early 30s, perhaps older, with dark hair and a composed expression. He wore a charcoal jacket. His hands were resting loosely in his lap. He hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. His silence was not cold, it was considerate. She closed her eyes, willing herself not to cry. The quiet presence beside her was oddly comforting. Her son sighed in his sleep, and she kissed the top of his head, grounding herself in that familiar scent. She had made a mistake. But it wasn't careless or foolish. It had been exhaustion. It had been motherhood. The flight attendant moved on down the aisle. Slowly, the whispers faded, and the hum of the engines filled the space. Julia sat quietly, her heart still racing, wondering what would happen next, and if, just maybe, this mistake was leading her exactly where she was meant to go. The plane had been taxiing for several minutes when the flight attendant returned to Julia's row, her tone hushed but kind. "It was our mistake," she said. "The other passenger's been rerouted, and since we've left the gate, you can stay on board. We'll assist you after landing." Julia nodded, cheek still flushed. She adjusted her son, asleep in her lap, his head slipping awkwardly to the side. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and exhaled. A subtle movement beside her caught her eye. The man in the aisle seat leaned forward, quietly removed his coat, folded it, and placed it beneath her son's head with careful precision. He didn't say a word, didn't meet her eyes. Just checked that the boy was comfortable, then resumed his silence. Julia whispered a soft "thank you." He nodded once. Outside the window, the last of the day faded into dusk. Inside, the soft hum of the engine filled the quiet. Julia leaned back, the tension in her shoulders easing a little. The man hadn't spoken to her once, yet his presence felt reassuring, gentle, grounding. Then, as the plane rose into the air, he finally spoke. "Rough day?" She turned, surprised. "More like a rough year." He gave a faint smile. "Fair enough." She hesitated, then added, "I was supposed to be flying to Maine to see my mom. Thought I booked the right flight, but apparently not." He glanced at her son. "At least you're not alone." She smiled gently. "That's Noah. He's 3. He's had a hard few months, severe asthma. I'd been working doubles just to afford his meds. My mom offered to help for a while, so we were headed there, or supposed to be." He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes, just listened. "I'm a waitress," she continued. "Evenings and weekends mostly. It's all I could get after my husband passed. Car crash, 2 years ago this February." Her voice caught, but she pressed on. "I've been doing okay, I guess, just tired. Some days I feel like the world's pressing down on me and I'm doing everything I can not to break." He nodded. "I know that feeling." His voice was quiet, but something in it made her look up. There was a shadow in his eyes, something he wasn't saying. "I've had moments," she said slowly, "where I've wished I could just get on the wrong flight, start over somewhere. Somewhere with no bills, no grief, no emergency room visits at 2 in the morning. He tilted his head. "Sounds like today you kind of did." She gave a soft laugh, then paused, her smile fading. "I used to think maybe I was cursed, like the universe had it out for me." She looked down at Noah, brushing his hair gently. "But maybe it's not a curse," she whispered. "Maybe I'm just on a longer route than most." The silence stretched between them, deep and full. "I used to think I was broken," she said. "But tonight, I think maybe I'm not." The man turned toward the window, the glow of the cabin lights reflected in the glass, catching in his eyes. He didn't speak. But something about him shifted. His shoulders relaxed, his jaw unclenched. Julia leaned back, holding her son a little closer. He nestled into the coat beneath him, sleeping soundly. The plane moved forward, high above a city neither of them planned to reach, yet maybe, just maybe, exactly where they were supposed to be. The plane hummed steadily beneath them, a soft vibration in the quiet cabin. Most passengers had sunk into silence or sleep, the overhead lights dimmed to a warm glow. Julia shifted gently in her seat, glancing down at Noah, still sleeping peacefully against her chest. She exhaled slowly, the emotional weight of the day beginning to settle. Then, beside her, the man spoke. "I had a daughter." His voice was even, but low, like the sound of someone remembering something fragile. "She died 5 years ago," he continued, "just a few weeks before her 4th birthday." Julia looked at him, her breath catching slightly. Noah had just turned 3. She felt her stomach clench. "Her name was Lily," he said. She had a tiny gap between her front teeth and this wild laugh that made strangers turn their heads. She was all joy, loud, fearless, stubborn as anything. He smiled faintly, but it faded almost as quickly as it came. "She got sick out of nowhere. We thought it was just a cold, then maybe a virus. It wasn't. It was leukemia, and it moved fast. The kind where treatment buys you time, but not enough. We spent months in hospitals. I memorized every tile in every waiting room." Julia stayed silent. She didn't want to break the delicate thread he was finally letting unwind. "After she died, we tried. My wife and I," he said. "We tried to be okay. But grief's funny like that. You think you're facing it together, but most of the time you're just surviving next to each other." He paused, staring straight ahead, his voice quieting even more. "Some nights I'd want to talk about Lily, every detail, and she couldn't bear to hear her name. Other nights she wanted to cry, and I'd already gone numb. It was like we kept missing each other." Julia nodded slowly, her throat tight. "We started fighting more," he added. "About everything. Dishes, bills, silences. She said I was gone all the time. I said I couldn't breathe in that house anymore." He looked down at his hands, his fingers flexing absently. 2 years after Lily passed, we signed the papers. No custody battles, No screaming, just silence and signatures. Julia felt her heart ache for the man beside her. Not just for the child he'd lost, but for the life that fell apart in the aftermath. "Since then, it's just been me," he said. "Work, travel, hotel rooms. I tell myself I'm keeping busy, but honestly, I think I'm just hiding." She hesitated for a moment, then gently reached over and laid her hand on top of his. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. He didn't pull away. His hand stayed beneath hers, still and heavy. "I've never told anyone all of that before," he said after a long pause. "Not like this, not in one breath." Julia's voice was barely above a whisper. "I think sometimes God lets two people with the same kind of scars find each other, so they remember they're not the only ones still bleeding." He turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes. His were glassy, rimmed with something raw and unspoken. "She would have been 8 this year," he said. "I wonder who she'd be now. I wonder if she'd still like that dumb cartoon about the dancing frogs. I kept the DVDs. I couldn't throw them out." Julia smiled gently. "Noah watches one with singing trucks. I've seen it so many times, I hear the songs in my sleep." He gave the smallest chuckle, his shoulders lifting, then settling again. "You're a good mom," he said quietly. She blinked. "You don't even know me." "I didn't need to," he said. "I saw it the moment you got embarrassed for a mistake that wasn't really your fault, and you never once let go of him." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, as if something inside him gave way, a single tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't wipe it. He didn't hide. It was the first time in 5 years he had allowed himself to cry for his daughter. Julia didn't say a word. She didn't offer to fix anything. She just held his hand, steady and warm, letting the silence settle like a blanket between them, soft, heavy, and full of understanding. Outside the window, the night stretched on, endless and dark. But for the first time in a long time, Christopher didn't feel alone in it. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, the wheels groaning against the tarmac. The familiar rush of deceleration filled the cabin as overhead bins rattled and passengers shifted in their seats, already reaching for bags and jackets. The lights brightened, casting a sterile glow over weary faces. Julia stirred slightly, adjusting Noah in her arms. He blinked sleepily, disoriented by the change in rhythm, then nestled deeper into her chest. She smoothed his hair absently, her thoughts not yet caught up to the moment. After hours of tension, confession, and silent understanding, the sudden return to the real world felt jarring. A flight attendant appeared at her row, voice low and polite. "Miss, when we deplane, someone from the airline will meet you at the gate. They'll help you get sorted and rerouted to your intended destination." Julia nodded, already feeling the weight of what was about to happen. She glanced once toward the man beside her, still seated, still composed. There was a slight crease in his brow now, something unspoken building beneath the surface. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, the cabin erupted into motion. People stood, pulled luggage, checked phones. Julia stayed still. Her son shifted, murmuring in his half-sleep. Passengers filed into the aisle. She remained in her seat until most had gone. Then, carefully, she gathered her bag, adjusted Noah in her arms, and turned slightly to face the man who had sat beside her for the flight she was never supposed to be on. "I'm sorry about earlier," she said quietly. "For the mix-up? For all of it?" He shook his head once. "Don't be." She hesitated. Her fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her bag. "My name is Julia," she said, as if remembering it only now mattered. "Thank you for not looking at me like I was a problem. For listening." His lips parted slightly, like he might say something. Anything, but no words came out. She gave a soft smile, tired but sincere. "You made a very strange night feel a little less terrifying." Then, just like that, she stepped into the aisle and walked away. He watched her go, Noah's small legs dangling against her hip, her figure quickly swallowed by the moving bodies and narrow corridor. She didn't turn around. She didn't leave a number. She hadn't even said her last name. And yet she had told him more about herself in a few quiet hours than most people had in years. Christopher sat still, the row around him empty now. The cabin had cleared, the noise fading to silence. He stared at the space she'd just occupied, the imprint still warm on the seat. The faint scent of baby powder and something soft, maybe lavender, lingered in the air. He wasn't a man prone to whimsy or longing. He lived in logic, schedules, contracts. But now, in the stillness, something pulled at him. An ache that felt too real for how short the encounter had been. There had been something honest in her eyes, something raw, unguarded, in her exhaustion, her embarrassment, her quiet resilience, and in the way she'd spoken about her son, her struggles, her pain, without a hint of self-pity. She had simply existed, without apology, and for a few hours he had felt something stir in him that he'd thought had died with Lily. He stood slowly, reaching for his coat, his fingers brushing the seatbelt buckle she'd just unlatched. He wondered if he should have asked. For a number? For a name? For something? But the moment had passed, she was gone, and all he had now was a first name, a memory, and the distinct feeling that something real, something rare, had slipped through his fingers. As he stepped off the plane, the noise of the terminal enveloped him. Screens blinked, announcements echoed, people rushed past. But everything felt oddly distant. Somewhere ahead, a woman named Julia was being escorted to fix a mistake, but to him, the real mistake was not finding a way to hold on to what had just walked away. Christopher couldn't stop thinking about her. It had been days since the flight, but Julia lingered in his mind like a melody that refused to fade. He replayed the sound of her voice, the curve of her tired smile, the way she'd held her son with fierce, quiet devotion. He remembered the way she said thank you, not out of politeness, but like it truly mattered. He didn't even know her last name. He could have asked the airline to look up the manifest. He had the power, the resources. But it felt wrong, too invasive, too clinical. Julia deserved more than to be tracked like a transaction. So instead, he wrote something else. Sitting at his desk early one morning, Christopher composed a short email to his company's internal communications team. He didn't know exactly why. He only knew that something inside him needed to be said. The note was simple. A thank you to a stranger. A reflection on how one unexpected meeting could stay with you long after the plane had landed. She boarded by mistake, he wrote. But she wasn't a mistake. She reminded me that people still carry goodness with them, even in the most exhausting, uncertain moments. She held her son like the world was watching. She spoke with honesty I hadn't heard in years. I never even got her full name, but I won't forget her. He sent it, not expecting anything. A few days later, someone from the marketing team reached out. One of their junior writers, Ellie, had read his note and been moved. "We'd love to share this," she said, "just as a story, something real. No names, of course, just initials. It might touch someone the way it touched us." Christopher hesitated only briefly before agreeing. The post went live on the company's blog under the title, "Some flights aren't mistakes. You just don't understand the destination yet." It spread like wildfire. People shared it online with captions like, "This gave me chills," and "Faith in humanity restored." Comments poured in, stories of strangers who had changed lives in quiet moments, of long flights that left lasting impressions, of chance meetings that felt like something more. Christopher read them all. And somewhere across the country, in a back room of the diner where she worked weekends, Julia's phone buzzed with a message from a former coworker. It was just a link and a line of text. "This sounds like you. You need to read it." She clicked, not expecting much, just curiosity. But as she scrolled, her breath caught in her throat. It was him. He hadn't said her name, he hadn't described her in detail, but it was all there. Her son, the wrong flight, the exhaustion, the honesty. The moment that had felt too real to be random. Her eyes filled with tears. She sat down on a bench near the kitchen, hands trembling as she held the phone. Noah was coloring nearby, humming softly to himself, his small voice rising and falling like a lullaby. She wiped her cheek, trying to compose herself, but it was too late. The emotion was already spilling over. "Mommy?" Noah looked up, puzzled. "Why are you crying?" Julia smiled through the tears. "I'm okay, sweetie." He looked at her more closely. "Is it the coat man?" She let out a quiet laugh, nodding. "Yes, it's the coat man." "Did he lose his coat?" "No," she whispered, brushing a hand over his hair. "I think he found something, and maybe I did too." She sat with the phone in her lap for a long moment, staring at the final lines of the post. There was a brief note from the editor encouraging anyone who might recognize themselves in the story to reach out. Julia hesitated. Then, quietly, she opened her email app and began to type a short message. Just a few lines. She didn't explain everything. She didn't need to. She simply said that she believed she was the woman from the flight, and that she had read his words, and they had reached her. When she hit send, her hands were still shaking. But for the first time in a long time, the trembling wasn't from fear. It was from the fragile, beautiful weight of being seen. Christopher was standing by the window of his office when the receptionist buzzed. "There's a Julia here to see you, sir." He didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the skyline, but his breath hitched just slightly. When he finally turned, he felt something shift inside him. Hope, nerves, maybe both. "Send her up," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. A few minutes later, Julia stepped into the room. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back, her eyes wide with uncertainty. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she smiled softly, and it was like a quiet door inside him open. "You really wrote that?" she asked. He nodded. "I really did." She looked around the office. Warm-toned wood, photographs of smiling children, quotes on the wall about resilience and community. "This is beautiful," she said, "all of it." He gestured toward a chair. "You have time for lunch?" They walked to a quiet restaurant nearby, not too fancy. Earthy tones, sunlight pouring through tall windows. As they sat down, the silence between them felt different now. Not uncomfortable, but full of anticipation. He asked about her, really asked. About Noah, about how she was managing, about what she wanted beyond survival. She hesitated, then said, "I used to dream of becoming a counselor. You know, helping young moms like me, the kind who are scared, alone, and feel invisible. But that dream, I had to let go of it." Christopher listened closely. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched her speak, as if each word revealed something sacred. When the food arrived, she ate slowly, distracted by nerves. "I know it sounds silly," she added. "Dreams don't really matter when rent's due and your kid needs medicine." "But they do," he said. "They matter more than most things." Julia looked at him for a long second. Then, as casually as if offering sugar for her coffee, he said, "I'd like to offer you a job." Her fork froze midair. "At the Phoenix Foundation," he clarified. "I started it after Lily passed. We've been expanding. We work with single-parent families, offer scholarships, mentorship, access to health care. But we're missing something, someone who truly understands what these women are facing." She blinked. "Wait, me? I don't have a degree. I don't even have a real resume." "You have what they need," he said gently. "You've lived it. You know what the textbooks leave out." Her eyes welled slightly, but she blinked the tears away. "You don't even really know me." "I know enough," he said. "And if I'm wrong, you can walk away, any time." Julia looked down at her hands. For a long time, she didn't speak. Then, with a voice softer than before, she said, "No one's ever believed in me like that." After the meal, they walked through a nearby park. The trees rustled above them, their footsteps slow against the stone path. "I thought about you a lot," Julia said. "So did I," Christopher admitted. He told her how the silence after the flight had felt louder than anything he'd heard in years. How, for the first time since losing Lily, he had felt something stir, something alive, something real. They stopped near a small fountain. The water sparkled in the sunlight, catching fragments of their reflections. "I used to tell myself I didn't need anyone," Julia said, "but I think I just didn't think anyone would ever stay." Christopher looked at her. "You stayed in my mind, Julia. That has to mean something." She smiled, eyes full of a question she wasn't quite ready to ask. They walked back slowly. A cab was already waiting by the curb. She turned to face him, her hand on the door handle. "Thank you for today," she said, "for everything." He hesitated. Then, just as she opened the door, he stepped forward. "Julia?" She looked up. He took a breath, then spoke, his voice low but steady. "I used to think I didn't have a heart anymore, that maybe when Lily died, it just stopped." She froze. "But today, if I don't reach for your hand," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "I'm afraid I'll lose the last beat I have left." The city sounds faded. It was just the two of them, and a moment that hung between yes and no. She reached out, without words, and took his hand, and for the first time in years, neither of them felt like they were standing alone. Julia arrived at the Phoenix Foundation on her first day with a heart full of nerves and a second-hand blazer that still carried the scent of lavender detergent. She had never worked in an office before. Her life had been filled with split shifts, sticky tables, and scraping together enough for rent. But now, for the first time in years, she walked into a place that didn't just need her labor. It needed her story. Christopher introduced her to the team as someone who's lived the mission more than any of us ever could. There was no condescension in his tone, no sense of charity, only quiet respect. Her title was Community Support Liaison, but what she really did was listen. To mothers who cried in her office, to teenagers with babies on their hips, to women who had learned to survive in silence. She listened, and when they finished, she offered what little she had, understanding, encouragement, and stories of her own. Each day she found herself growing more confident, more rooted. She helped shape new support programs, improved the intake process, and even sat in on scholarship interviews. Her input was raw but invaluable. The board listened. So did Christopher. At home, things changed too. Noah, now enrolled in a preschool that specialized in children with respiratory needs, began to flourish. He made friends. His coughs became less frequent. His laughter came easier. For the first time, Julia didn't have to choose between groceries and inhalers. Christopher visited often, not always with purpose, sometimes just to drop off a book for Noah or a container of soup he claimed was left over from a staff lunch. Noah began calling him Mr. Logan, then upgraded to Uncle Logan, and eventually Mommy's friend Logan. Julia didn't correct him. There was never a formal conversation about feelings, no grand declarations. But in the space between meetings and late afternoon coffees, something quiet bloomed. She noticed it in the way he opened doors for her, without thinking, in the way he stayed late when she was overwhelmed, in the text messages that asked how her day was and truly waited for an answer. He noticed it in her laughter, real, unforced, returning slowly like spring after a long, bitter winter. In the way she remembered the names of every single mother who walked through the foundation's doors, in how she always left his office neater than she found it. Their love didn't arrive like a storm, it arrived like dawn, gentle, slow, warming everything it touched. There were dinners, sometimes in his apartment, sometimes in hers. Simple meals, pasta, roasted vegetables, Noah's favorite dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets. Julia laughed more. Christopher softened. Sometimes, after Noah went to bed, they'd sit on her worn couch with cups of tea, talking about nothing and everything. One evening, as Julia folded laundry, Christopher quietly picked up a sock and helped. She looked at him, amused. "Pretty sure you don't need to be folding my kids' pajamas," she teased. He shrugged. "It's oddly calming." They smiled at each other, and neither looked away. Sometimes, when Julia was tired, bone-deep tired in the way only single mothers understand, He would pull a blanket over her shoulders, not say a word, and just sit nearby until she drifted off. Noah adored him. He'd save drawings to give Uncle Logan and insisted Christopher attend his class's Special Person Day. "Why me?" Christopher asked once, crouching to tie the boy's shoe. "Because you always come back," Noah answered simply. Julia overheard and had to step into the kitchen before she cried. That was the difference, really. Christopher stayed. He didn't try to fix everything. He didn't pretend he could erase her past or his. But he stood beside her, in the quiet, in the chaos, in the healing, and Julia, once convinced she was too broken to be loved, found herself slowly unfolding. Not into someone new, but into someone who could love again and be loved, gently, consistently, completely. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting golden light on the white walls of the newly opened center. Laughter echoed off tile floors. Children ran with balloons. Volunteers handed out refreshments. There were name tags, hugs, and teary smiles from women who never thought anyone would build a place like this just for them. The Phoenix Center for Single Parents had been a dream, and now it stood, real, warm, alive. Julia stood near the entrance, her arms wrapped loosely around herself, watching it all unfold. She wore a pale blue dress, simple and elegant, her blonde hair tucked gently behind her ears. Beside her, Noah held tightly to her hand, munching a cookie and grinning at every face that passed. She didn't know where Christopher had gone. He'd been greeting guests, thanking donors, checking last-minute details, until she saw him step onto the small platform in the front of the room, clearing his throat into the microphone. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady. "Not just for being here today, but for believing in this idea. A place where stories matter, where resilience is honored, where no one walks alone." There was soft applause. Julia smiled, proud. He continued, "But before we close, I have one last thing I'd like to say, or rather, something I'd like to ask." And then, slowly, in front of everyone, he stepped down from the platform and walked straight toward her. The room hushed. Julia blinked, unsure of what was happening, until he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He knelt. The crowd gasped. Julia's hand flew to her mouth, tears rushing to her eyes. "This belonged to my mother," Christopher said, his voice full of quiet emotion. "She gave it to me years ago and said, 'When you find someone who reminds you that your heart still beats, give this to her.'" He opened the box. Inside was a delicate gold ring, simple but beautiful, with a small stone that caught the light like a promise. "I never thought I'd love again, Julia," he said. "I didn't think I could. But then you boarded the wrong flight and turned out to be everything I never knew I needed." He took a breath. "Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks as she laughed, a soft, disbelieving sound full of joy and wonder. She nodded, too overcome to speak. Then she bent down, pulled him into a tight embrace, and whispered into his ear, "I used to think no one could ever love someone like me. But I forgot. Love finds the heart that still dares to hope." The room erupted into applause. Noah clapped louder than anyone, his smile stretching from ear to ear. They held each other in the middle of it all, surrounded by people, but in their own quiet world. Weeks later, the three of them boarded a plane, destination, their first vacation as a family. Noah sat by the window, his face pressed to the glass. Julia sat in the middle seat, Christopher on the aisle. Their fingers were intertwined, resting gently between them. As the plane lifted off, Julia looked out at the clouds, her eyes shimmering. She leaned closer to Christopher, her voice low but certain. "This time," she said, smiling, "it's the right flight." Sometimes the wrong flight takes you exactly where you're meant to be. Julia boarded with nothing but exhaustion, heartache, and a 3-year-old boy asleep in her arms. And somehow, she landed in the arms of someone who saw her worth, not her wounds. Love doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it's quiet, gentle, and takes the shape of a second chance. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Soul Stirring Stories, where real-life miracles and emotional journeys come to life. Your next favorite story is just one click away. Subscribe now and never miss a moment that could change the way you see love, life, and resilience.